Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to episode number 24 of The Apple and the Hero. My name is Sara Orfali, and today I would like to be your guide on the pathways of history. We have left our Roman Respublica celebrating its triumphs, first against the Samnites, and then against Pyrrhus, king of Epirus. For the little city-state in Latium, such victories weren't just important because they brought Rome new territory, although that was a great part of the achievement, considering that the Romans had basically gained the entire south of Italy out of these wars, but also because, for the first time in its history, a mostly landlocked nation had finally obtained its first big outlet to the sea. The wars against the Samnites had netted Rome peak place in the pecking order of Italy, and a spate of new military inventions, weapons and techniques. And their victory against Pyrrhus, a very good representative of the Hellenistic post-Alexandrine world, had finally gained the Romans' entrance to the economical and political world centered around the Mediterranean. Now used to the taste of victory, and willing to play with the big boys, it seemed inevitable that the Romans would find themselves against one of the main powers of the Mediterranean area, the Carthaginians. To be fair, Romans and Punics, as the Romans referred to the Carthaginians, didn't start out as enemies. Quite the contrary, in fact. For many decades, what bonded Rome and Carthage together wasn't a mutual desire to see the other destroyed, but mercantile treaties meant to define clear areas of influence and give both powers the chance of profiting from one another. And even on the military front, the two had somewhat agreed at one point, not too long before the start of the Punic Wars. When Pyrrhus had come to Sicily, both Carthaginians and Romans had been united in their desires to see the king of Epirus out of the Italian peninsula and back where he'd come from. So how did they go from economic equals to bitter enemies, engaging not just in one, but in 3 different wars in the span of a century? This is exactly the story I want to tell you in this and in the next episode. So let me welcome you, my fellow travelers, to the Punic Wars. 3 times the Romans and the Carthaginians battled each other to the bitter end, and 3 times the Romans won, displaying their characteristic courage, abnegation, and the capacity to adapt to anything and come back stronger. Of the 3 Punic Wars, the best remembered is the second one, where the undeniable protagonist is Hannibal, the Carthaginian general who descended on Rome to fulfill his childhood oath of never being the Romans' friends. And while Scipio Africanus was a good counterpoint, capable of masterfully defeating Hannibal in the end, his fame is somewhat less enduring than the Carthaginians'. Next, most people would probably remember the third and final Punic War, if nothing else because the image of sprinkling salt over the ruins of the enemy is a powerful and long-lasting message. Almost no one, though, remembers the first Punic War, despite the fact that not only was this the conflict that sparked the following 100 years of bloodshed, but also this was the war featuring the biggest naval battle of the entire history, which is not an hyperbole on my part, but really how historians have defined it. For Rome, each war saw the rise of heroes. Each war demonstrated the ingenuity of the Roman people and their immense capacity for adapting quickly to any situation and getting stronger, even in defeat. For Carthage, on the other hand, the wars represented the end of it all. Only ruins would remain where once a prosperous empire had stood. For both, the wars were an immense sacrifice of money, armament, and most importantly, people. There are few moments in history where, if things had gone in another direction, the entire history would have changed. the Punic Wars are one of these moments. Had the Carthaginians managed to win, our history would be very different indeed. So, how did we get to such a watershed moment? What possessed these two powers to decide that the only way forward was to duke it out? Well, if we want to believe Virgil and his Aeneid, then the casus belli was far more ancient than the wars themselves, and it was rooted in love. Or better yet, jilted love, rather than geopolitical considerations. If you remember, in the very first episode of this deep dive in Roman history, we met Aeneas, the Trojan hero escaping his city in flames and then wandering through the Mediterranean before coming to central Italy in Latium. Halfway through his journey, Virgil made his hero stop at Carthage, where he fell in love with a widowed Carthaginian queen, Dido. On the eve of their wedding, Aeneas was suddenly reminded by Jupiter that his destiny lied elsewhere. And so he left Dido quite literally at the altar, and the lovesick queen just killed herself in desperation. By telling this story, Virgil was trying to give an explanation to the hatred that, between the 3rd and the 2nd century BC, bound Rome and Carthage in 3 bloody wars. As you might have imagined, in reality the motivations behind the wars were less romantic and way more prosaic. The First Punic War started when Romans and Carthaginians wanted to establish control over the strategic island of Sicily. A request from the Mamertines, a group of mercenaries who had revolted against their previous master, the city of Syracuse, and were now being hunted by them, sparked the conflict between the Romans and the Carthaginians. Demonstrating their clear superiority on land, the Romans advanced quickly through Sicily and in under 2 years managed to bring the island under their control. As they looked at the vast expanse of sea in front of them, Rome realized that to win the war, it would need to best Carthage on its turf, the waters. Having never sailed on anything more complicated than fresh water, the Romans were at a clear disadvantage, especially since they had no navy to speak of. Demonstrating their great skills in absorbing anything even remotely useful from their enemies, the Romans appropriated some Carthaginian ships for themselves and copied them, thus building an impressive navy from scratch. Knowing that their greatest talent laid in land fighting, the Romans added a moving gangplank to their ships, the so-called corvus, which hooked onto the enemy vessel, creating a space perfect for a land fight. In the span of under 5 years, the Romans had gone from being almost exclusively a land power to being a strong candidate for the title of leader of the Mediterranean. The greatest naval battle in history, the Battle of Cape Economus, which saw 140,000 Romans on 360 ships fighting against 150,000 Carthaginians on 350 ships, ended with a spectacular Roman victory, which opened the way for a land invasion of Africa. And it's here that we finally meet the hero of the First Punic War. His name was Marcus Atilius Regulus, one of the 2 consuls sent to Africa to conquer Carthage directly. He had already demonstrated his valor by winning the Battle of Cape Economus, and his unbeaten streak of victories continued during his military campaign on African soil. Emboldened by the continuous triumphs, Regulus entered negotiations with Carthage, offering unbearably harsh peace conditions, promptly refused by the Carthaginian Senate. Realizing that their hodgepodge mercenary army wouldn't be enough to win against the Romans, the Carthaginians relied on the expertise of Spartan commander Xantippus. He reorganized the army, updated the strategies and the armament, and fought the Romans in the Battle of Tunis. Regulus's cockiness proved to be his downfall. Only 2,000 of his soldiers survived, and he, along with another 500 Romans, was captured by the Carthaginians. In an unexpected reversal of fortunes, the 2,000 survivors were picked up by the Roman fleet, only to die during the crossing back to Sicily due to an unforeseen storm which sank the entire Roman fleet. At this point, history tells us that Regulus died in captivity and that the war continued for another 13 years, with both Rome and Carthage inching closer and closer to bankruptcy. It was Carthage who folded first, forfeiting the war and entering peace negotiation with Rome, which saw the Carthaginians pay an exorbitant amount of war reparation money to the Romans. The legend, though, tells us something different. Emboldened by the sudden disaster striking the Roman fleet, the Carthaginians sued for peace on their terms. Regulus, now a prisoner of war, told the Carthaginians that if they let him go to Rome, he would negotiate for peace on behalf of Carthage, promising to return if the Romans wouldn't accept the terms. For reasons we aren't told, the Carthaginians decided to accept his offer and let him go. Upon his arrival, Regulus went straight for the Senate, where, after recounting what had happened and what it seemed, especially the fact that Carthage seemed to be the one on the edge of economic collapse, he persuaded the Romans not to accept the peace treaty. Then, despite knowing he would be executed if he ever returned with a negative answer, Regulus honored his promise and went back to Carthage, where he was tortured and killed. While his story now is considered nothing more than a legend, it still reflected the values and morals the Romans looked for in their heroes. With or without Regulus's sacrifice, the war ended with Roman victory, but some seeds of hatred sown during this conflict would bloom over the next few decades, forcing Rome and Carthage onto the battlefield once again. Soon after the end of the conflict, the huge war reparations that Rome had imposed on Carthage and the disruption, if not the complete annihilation of their usual trade routes, brought the Punic city on the brink of collapse. There was no money to even pay the mercenaries who had fought for the Carthaginians. It was in the midst of the following war, aptly named the Mercenaries' War, that an unlikely hero came to Carthage's rescue. Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal's father, had been one of the most successful military commanders during the First Punic War, and his army had come out of the conflict mostly unscathed. He had pressed the Carthaginian Senate to keep the war with the Romans going. After all, he hadn't yet been defeated, and had been very disappointed when the city had forced him to stand down. While there was no love lost between him and Carthage, Hamilcar still came to the aid of the city, gaining the Senate's favour by winning the war. Once he had gained the Carthaginians' elite's trust, Hamilcar came forward with an ambitious plan. The disruption of the trade routes had made it almost impossible for the Carthaginians to raise the necessary money to pay the Romans. So why not assemble an army and go conquer some of the lands in North Africa to make up for the lost mercantile revenue? The Carthaginian Senate found this a very good idea. So Hamilcar packed his bags, his army and his sons, Hannibal, Hasdrubal and Mago, and marched over towards the Media. It's said that Hamilcar didn't spare even one last look for his city, but he made sure to appease the gods with a sacrifice, where he made his eldest son Hannibal swear an oath he would never befriend the Romans. Without encountering too much opposition, he and his army soon arrived at the Pillars of Hercules, from where, without the approval of the Senate, they crossed over into Spain. For the following 8 years, Hamilcar strengthened his army until it was functioning as a perfect unit, completely loyal to the Barcid family. It would be this army, the one that would follow Hannibal over the Alps. A regular delivery of silver kept the Carthaginian Senate from stopping him, and when the Romans inquired as to why he was bringing his army closer and closer to Rome, He simply replied he was gathering the necessary means to pay for the war reparations the Romans themselves had imposed. Satisfied by this explanation, the Romans surprisingly backed off. We don't know exactly when or how Hamilcar died, but I like best the version of the story in which he sacrificed himself to protect his sons. His place was then taken by his son-in-law Hasdrubal. Yes, I know, at this point in time, almost every Carthaginian seemed to have been named the same. He's only important in this story because he made a treaty with the Romans, defining the Ebro River in Spain as the boundary between Romans and Carthaginians' territories. The Ebro River was and still is a river flowing through Cantabria and Catalonia, so in the northeast of Spain. While the Romans hadn't particularly liked the thought of Carthaginians in Spain, they had let things go, provided that the barked men stayed on the south of the Ebro. And then, 6 years after the Ebro Treaty, Rome signed an agreement with the city of Saguntum, which was situated well south of the river Ebro. For Hannibal, now at the head of the army, this was a clear violation of the treaty, while the Romans argued that Saguntum was, in fact, north of the river and clearly in their territory. This has brought many historians to doubt that the Ebro River today was the one referred to in the treaty. Where that river actually was located, it doesn't matter. What mattered is that Hannibal decided that the Romans had broken the word first, so he laid siege to the city of Saguntum. For 8 months the city tried to resist, begging Rome to send aid and being ignored and denied over and over again. While the Romans were indeed preoccupied in Illyria in the Balkan Peninsula, their failure to come to their allies' aid brought about the Second Punic War. As Saguntum fell, Rome sent an embassy headed by Quintus Fabius Maximus. Keep the name in mind because we're going to meet him again later, to Carthage, demanding the liberation of the city and the handover of Hannibal to Rome. The Carthaginians refused, and the Romans declared war. The year was 218 BC. Rome split its forces into 3 armies, sending one to Carthage, one to Saguntum, and a smaller contingent placed at the borders with Gaul in northern Italy, in order to discourage the local populations from attacking Rome when the bulk of the army was away. Hannibal immediately realized that fighting the Romans either in Africa or in Spain would result in Carthage's slow defeat, so he decided to take a gamble, a risky gamble. With the bulk of the army away from Italian soil, Rome was vulnerable. So what better way to win the war than attack the enemy right where they were weak? Hannibal decided to bring the war to Italy. Coming by sea would have meant being spotted right away, so the Carthaginian commander decided to take the land route. Technically, there is a small exit corridor between Italy and France that's not full of mountains, but it was patrolled both by the Romans and by the city of Massilia, modern-day Marseille, a Roman ally. For these reasons, Hannibal was forced to take the Alpine passes. While all of them are beautiful, none of them is really suitable to be crossed by an entire army, and definitely not by elephants. And yet, that's exactly what Hannibal did. Over the course of a couple of weeks, the Carthaginian general moved his entire army across Alpine passes, which had already begun to ice over. According to various sources, he had started out with 90,000 heavy infantry and 12,000 cavalry, and by the end of his mad crossing, he was left with only 50,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. Although, to his credit, most of the elephants did survive. As what was left of the army took a breather, Hannibal set out to recruit the Gauls living in northern Italy, who clearly had no love for Rome. As the Carthaginian army was gathering supplies and men once again, Rome was frantically trying to scrap together enough forces to at least have a chance against Hannibal. The fact that Rome managed to throw together a shoddy army was due entirely to the fast thinking of the Roman consul Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio. He had crossed swords with Hannibal en route to Spain, and despite not being able to stop him, he had realized what the Carthaginians had been trying to do. Sending his army onwards to Spain without him, Scipio had rushed back to Rome as fast as he could, and persuaded the Senate that he was neither mad nor a deserter, and that Hannibal was really coming from the north. With the bulk of the legions headed for Spain and Africa, there wasn't much that Scipio could do, but he and his soldiers bravely fought Hannibal and his Gaul allies in the Battle of the Ticino, where the Romans lost and Scipio was almost killed. Such a small victory wasn't much, but it gave the Carthaginians a morale boost and let the Gauls see that the Romans weren't invincible, and so a lot of the local tribes defected to Hannibal. At this point, the Roman Senate recalled the other consul, Sempronius Longus, from Sicily, sending him to fight alongside Scipio. Scipio suggested caution, while Sempronius itched for a fight. Knowing that when both consuls were on the same field, they would need to exercise supreme power on alternating days, Hannibal sprang a trap. The ensuing battle in the cold and sleet ended with more than 25,000 Roman soldiers dead, although Sempronius escaped with his life. Hannibal seemed invincible. Very much convinced that Hannibal's aim was to conquer Rome, when in reality the Carthaginian general had only wanted to break up the coalition of tribes who had sworn their allegiance to Rome, the Romans rushed to stop Hannibal's army. Poor preparation, shoddy tactic, and sloppy military commands on the Romans' part gained the Carthaginians yet another victory in the Battle of the Lake Trasimeno, and costed the Romans the death of another 30,000 soldiers. Even the invincible Roman war machine, capable of churning out legions after legions, regardless of how many defeats they suffer, was starting to falter. It was time to resort to a reliably proven solution: nominate a dictator. The choice fell onto Quintus Fabius Maximus. Remember him, the ambassador sent over to Carthage after the siege of Saguntum? That one. And while neither his contemporaries nor history seemed to favour him that much, he really was the best choice the Roman Senate could have ever made. While literally everybody else had simply charged at Hannibal without any semblance of a plan, Fabius's strategy was quite the opposite. Yes, Hannibal was a military genius, but if the Romans never engaged into battle with the Carthaginians, then the general would never be able to display his talent. And so Fabius started a 6-month campaign simply aimed at avoiding Hannibal. He targeted his supply lines and only accepted minor engagements on very favourable terrain. This avoided the defeats that would have surely come if the Romans had faced the Carthaginians head-on. Needless to say, the Romans hated this strategy, as exemplified by the epithet with which Fabius is famous: cunctator, the delayer. While today he would be a sterling example of guerrilla tactics, he was mostly seen as a coward by his contemporaries. While the Romans were convinced that Fabius's tactics weren't leading them anywhere, Hannibal saw the real damages that were being inflicted onto his army and supply lines. And so he displayed his genius once again and played into the discontent of the Romans. He started burning everything except Fabius's lands, thus making the Romans believe that their dictator was nothing but a traitor. With malcontent growing, distrust started to breed in the army. Even Fabius's own master of the horse, his second in command, basically was against him. Once, as Fabius had been called away to assist in a sacrifice, he left the command of the army to Minutius, the master of the horse, with strict orders not to engage Hannibal. Minutius disobeyed and attacked anyway, managing to make several enemy units withdraw. While not a victory by any standard, it was the piece of good news that the Romans had been waiting for, and they hailed Minutius as their hero and savior. And, most importantly, in what I can only suppose was a fit of political madness, they nominated Minutius as co-dictator alongside Fabius. Please keep in mind that there was a very specific reason why a dictator was nominated alone, and that giving him a co-ruler would actually void his powers. Still, this was the will of the people, and so Minutius got the job. Fabius could have technically just demoted him. If you remember, the dictator's powers were supposed to be absolute, but he just decided to wait for the inevitable disaster that would happen when Minutius would face Hannibal in battle. Rejecting Minutius' idea of both commanding the full army on alternate days, Fabius decided to split the army in two and keep full command over one half of it. As Fabius gave his co-dictator enough rope to hang himself with, it didn't take long for Minutius to simply rush against Hannibal, finding himself and his army pinned into a trap. Anybody, even just a smidge pettier than Fabius, would have left Minutius to rot, thus unequivocally proving that his strategy was the best of course of action. But Fabius was a good and honourable man, and made haste to rescue his colleague. As Fabius's own forces entered the battlefield, Hannibal retreated and Minutius was saved. I don't think Fabius expected much in the way of gratitude. Sure, he'd saved his co-dictators behind, but Minutius didn't seem like a man who would admit his mistake and offer thanks. So I think he must have been positively surprised when Minutius marched his men into Fabius' encampment, went down to his knees in front of him, and said, and I quote, "My father gave me life. Today you saved my life. You are my second father. I recognize your superior abilities as a commander." This was the end of their weird political experiment of co-dictatorship, and also the moment where Fabius' tactics were finally recognized. Yes, he hadn't squared off against Hannibal directly, but he'd managed to lure him away from Rome, and he had inflicted sizable losses to the Carthaginians by disrupting their supply lines. And if the Romans had taken time to recognize the genius of Fabius' tactics, Hannibal had been thoroughly impressed by them since the very beginning, going insofar as to declare Fabius as another Hannibal. Greatest compliment had probably never been paid to the poor cunctator. And yet, while Fabius' strategies had stopped Hannibal from conquering the city of Rome, they were still not enough to get rid of the Carthaginians completely. It would take a different kind of hero, not a delayer this time, but a man with bold initiative to finally turn the tables on a war that had seemed to be going Carthage's way from the very first moment. Still, while victory would crown the Romans as their champions in the end, they would still need to survive the greatest loss in their history. When I started writing this episode, my intention had been to present all three of the Punic Wars together. But then, as word after word spilled onto the page, I realized that mine had been nothing but a pipe dream. Sure, I could cram the wars together, but the losses I would incur in doing so would have made this episode a Pyrrhic victory. So I bid you goodbye for now, my fellow travellers, and wait for you in the next episode, when we'll bring the curtains down on this watershed moment in European history. In the meantime, I invite you once again to join me on my Instagram channel, The Apple and the Hero. And when you do, please say hi. I am very happy to make your acquaintance. As always, all the research and the writing for this episode has been done by me, Sara Orfali, Doctor in History. Goodbye for now. Safe travels.